Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 2025 Supply Chain ESG Risk Outlook. My name's JP Stevenson. I'm the Global Head of Market Development for EIQ, and it's my pleasure to host you today. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items of housekeeping on how to participate in today's event. You've joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You'll have the opportunity to ask questions at the end of today's session. Please do, during the course of the session today, just submit your questions via text, and any questions that we don't get to at the end of the session, we'll follow up personally afterward. Today's webinar is being recorded, and you'll receive a follow-up email within 48 hours with a link to view the recording. Now, it's my pleasure to present to you our outlook for 2025. Our outlook for 2025 is intended to be an outlook. So, our approach for discussing risk today will really focus on a few areas. First, we'll include a retrospective to look at new risks that are present within EIQ that we see through our risk data. But we'll also spend a bit of time touching on key themes that we see developing our outlook so that you might have an understanding to begin to position your responsible sourcing program to capture risks that, although not perhaps present today, may present themselves within your approach to risk management in 2025. If we take a higher level view, I think of the key theme around what our outlook suggests, there's really an increased focus that you will see in today's session on disclosure quality. We see this within regulations, which we'll touch on, where now there is an ask to do more with the risk assessment processes that you're running. ESG risk and your risk assessment now in many markets is regulated. But we'll also see this in the way that actually emerging geopolitical factors might shape the way that risks present themselves. In particular, I think there's three themes that are interesting for us to explore. The first, which I think is important in understanding our overall risk outlook, is because we are now in a period where ESG laws have been hard coded and there is a greater expectation that buyers will undertake audits. We're actually working with a far richer data set than certainly what we would have a decade ago. Our approach to risk management is built around undertaking about 25,000 social audits every year. There's other data sources that go in. But again, because the volume of audits have proliferated, what we're seeing within our data is a reflection on having better sources of visibility into risk within past years. So when we talk about something being high risk, in so much as it's intended to suggest that this is a risk that you should be aware of, the dynamics that might have driven this shift are difficult to isolate. I think we should be very upfront with that. And oftentimes, when we see more risk, it's also because more risk assessments are being done, more audits are being done. And so we're working on a richer data set rather than change in the inherent risk environment necessarily. A second theme that we want to touch on today is really on anticipated changes in the global trade environment. I think that the biggest change that we have seen and will see moving forward is with the change of political administration in the US and what this might mean, obviously, for ESG, but also for traditional supply chain networks. We know a key theme for how trade is looking at being regulated is, perhaps greater levels of protectionism. We've heard talks of tariffs of on goods outbound from China into the US of 30 to 60%. Should these changes go through under a new Trump administration, it's really difficult to understate the impact that this might have on our ability to effectively manage risk and also the way that new risks might emerge as a result of it. We'll explore that today as well. Our third theme is really, I think, on a knock on effect on due diligence requirements. We've seen, because of how Europe has approached regulation of risk, laws like the EUDR and the consequences that they're having now on supplier scrutiny, that there's oftentimes a bifurcation in production markets and how individual actors can participate. One very specific consequence that we've seen with this, that I think the full set of results from this we're just beginning to see understand, is the way that SMEs have in particular been isolated from global trade networks as greater compliance expectations also may manifest. So if you don't have the time to listen to the full of the presentation, I guess those three themes should shape the way that you begin positioning your responsible sourcing program within the coming year, outside of just the risk data that you'll see present both in our webinar and in the follow-up report that's going out, because these all represent factors that, although not necessarily present within the data today, certainly will change the way that ESG risk operates in 2025. For those of you that are tuning in for the first time, before we get into the risk itself, I do want to provide a brief overview on who we are as LRQA, because I think it's important in informing how you understand how we report on risk. LRQA is the leading global assurance partner for supply chains. We really work across 5 broad sets of problems globally. One is asset assurance, another is product integrity. Third, core to our discussion today, is how one might source responsibly. We work on supporting our clients navigating the energy transition. And we also work on emergent forms of risk in other fields like cybersecurity. We have over 60,000 clients globally, but the perspective I think that really sets us apart when it comes to how we look at risk is our presence within production markets. We have over 5,000 staff, many of whom sit next to the factory. Our process for disclosing and evaluating forms of risk are built around factory assessments, social audits, as I mentioned. And so when we make statements around why risk is present, this isn't done through a flimsy methodology as you might see in other forms of risk assessment. This is built around having certified auditors that are spending multiple days on sites and using the industry's most rigorous framework for assessing responsible sourcing related risks across labor issues, health and safety issues, environmental issues, issues of business ethics, and management systems. And so when we rate, it is because our auditors have seen this risk present within the ground of production markets. This is not to say this is definitive. There's a lot of risks that I think a singular approach cannot capture. But again, when we report it, it's really from a position of having what we think is the industry's highest quality data set for evaluating risk. The approach that we take to disclosure is driven by technology. So some of you are aware, we have a business unit called EIQ. EIQ for the past 8 years has been the technology infrastructure that has backed much of our disclosure process. It is what compiles our risk ratings. It's what allows responsible sourcing programs to run robust risk assessments, plan how they might have direct interventions on the site, and also then work through problems of remediation and reporting. We're happy to talk more about EIQ for anyone that's interested as a part of our follow-up conversation. I will say, though, that to the point on why our point of view is credible, we were recently named by Verdantix, the global leader in market intelligence, as the only firm to be a leader in both its approach to supply chain management technology for ESG and also ESG business assurance services. So, we think, if anything, that this just suggests what we've seen all along, which is you really have a much better data set to work with in running your risk assessment process when it is something that is built around strict protocols that can now meet an assurable standard. Now, why does a really, really robust risk process matter now more so than ever? Well, if you've watched our previous webinars, you'll be familiar with a statement that we made in the past two, that really by 2025, over a third of global consumer markets will be regulated. 2025 is around the corner in several months, and we are on track to see this realized. There's been multiple due diligence regulations that have been put in place across global markets. For the full list of it, I would suggest you check our website, where we track each of these regulations. But if we look at them holistically, I think, again, the theme of disclosure quality comes up. We see this actually in the way that some of the most long-standing ESG due diligence measures are being reconsidered. In both Australia and the United Kingdom, there is a revisitation of their modern slavery frameworks. The pertinent question there is, after multiple years of having built responsible sourcing programs, asking folks to disclose on their practices for assessing and controlling risks, regulators are now asking the question of if these programs are fit for purpose for their intention, which is to manage and mitigate risk. In particular, to the conversation in Australia, there is a question of why, after having multiple years of a regulated framework for modern slavery, we're not seeing more instances of positive disclosure. If these programs are being built, why are folks not reporting on what they are finding within their supply chains, at least publicly? And so I think, more than anything else, when we look at how programs need to be restructured, rebuilt for operating in a period of regulated risk, it's important to ask the question of whether or not your risk assessment framework captures at least much of what we're seeing within the way that we approach, evaluate, and identify ESG risk across supply chains. Because there is a not insignificant risk that many of the practices that firms have in place are not necessarily robust enough or structured methodologically in the right way to actually generate disclosures that are legally passable. Outside of just the expectation around disclosure quality, there has also been an expansion of scope. We see this in the extent to which supply chains are now being asked to look at certainly trade, non-trade, but also your tier 1, tier 2 plus. Certain laws will also have an expectation that you're able to trace down to the commodity level. And even while some of those are not in effect today yet, or being reevaluated for how they might be scaled back some, we still think it's inevitability that your expectation as a responsible sourcing manager will be to have a fully transparent supply chain within the next few years that is built around the data that you're able to gather, that's unique to your operations, but then also evaluated by a third party in a way that allows it to credibly pass, the litmus test of does your responsible sourcing program do what it's intended to do, and are risks being surfaced? Um, to tee this up, one of the biggest concerns that we have, and this is one that we have seen present across our past several years of webinars, has been on the transparency of disclosure quality. We find in 2024, our last update to our outlook in just July of this year, that in key global production markets, only as many as 50% of audits in China, as an example, are transparent. What this means is that when the auditor goes on site, there's a level of confidence that what is being evaluated is an accurate representation of the factory's operations, even if there are problems. What this means is that half the times when audits are commissioned, and audits do form the basis of most of the best responsible sourcing programs that we look at, the findings are inconsistent or inconclusive. This could be because there is a suspicion that there's double books, because there are double books that are identified, because the audit process is influenced some way by factories in a way that would compromise the disclosure quality, and oftentimes as well too because there's suspicion that workers are perhaps coached, or they're positioned in a way that would not lead you to be able to pass this as a credible evaluation of a site. Now, if we think about this again in the terms of like this bigger theme around how ESG risk is being regulated, if your audits aren't passable, if you're not able to get accurate data around it, your disclosure process fails from the beginning, and nothing else that you does matters. I would say with this, there are some key programmatic themes that we see emerge around the way that certain standards might address this. One common theme that we have seen, especially as due diligence expectations have expanded to encompass new asks. Maybe it's that you go deeper in your supply chain. Maybe that's if you have not had a responsible sourcing program historically, you begin to look at actually risk in a way that would require you to, for the first time, run evaluations. We've really seen, I think, two forms of mechanisms for risk assessment that have come short. One of them would be certain mutual recognition schemes. And this oftentimes originates from an incentive problem. If a factory is having their results shared broadly across, say, 50 sites or so, sure, as the brand, it's expedient to get your results with it, but there is also a tremendous disincentive for the site to disclose accurately their performance. It becomes too punitive. And so even if the one-to-one evaluation that you would have is prone to having problems around how the site might talk about risk, this complicates it further because there's an even greater incentive to obscure how the factory is actually performing. I'd say also the adjoining challenge with this is how it changes the effectiveness of certain protocols like self-assessment questionnaires. If we know that half the time in places like China, when you're going and sending an auditor in on site to evaluate risk, the data is not good, do we really think that a self-assessment questionnaire-based process, be it on carbon data collection, or even a broader ask around really understanding the network of ties that would make up your supply chain, do we really think that's bankable? Probably not. And so in so much as folks now begin to look at how they might build out a deeper understanding of their supply chain without first addressing this problem of transparency. We have major concerns over the quality of data that would back this process. Our steer with this would be several fold. First, we're happy to look and work with you on how you might benchmark the effectiveness of your risk assessment tools to see whether or not there is effective capture of high criticality risks. Your zero tolerances. This is really where we think it's most important, because the cost of being wrong is too dire to miss. But then the second thing is, I think programs need to think deeply about how they gear their sites up for disclosure. And this is a bigger theme that we'll revisit later on in the webinar and providing a bit more guidance with you. But there needs to be a mindset shift in the relationship that we have with factories around how positive disclosure is treated. Because, if, again, you're going to cite risk is not being appropriately captured, it's very oftentimes because the supplier assumes that there's penalties that would be too complicated for them to deal with, and effectively priming the conversation around your expectations, and also positioning this in the context of not how you necessarily cut suppliers, but work with the supplier on continuous improvement as the outcome of the risk assessment process. That can help a lot in addressing this transparency problem. We also think that changes in global trade relations will complicate this further. Returning to the changes that we have seen in how a Trump administration might change U.S.-China relations, what have we learned so far from the U.S.-China trade war? Does tougher policies on Chinese sites necessarily fundamentally decouple Chinese supply chains from American consumer markets? No. In fact, what we see oftentimes is an elongation of supply chains, where final stage production might move to markets in Southeast Asia, or perhaps nearer shore, Mexico, we've talked about in previous webinars. But oftentimes this can present two challenges. First, you have an additional node within your supply chain, which might complicate your ability to reach deeper upstream to where there might be the most severe forms of risk present. But second, when you see a reformation of supply chains, in particular around new production markets, you're also in some ways starting from scratch within these markets. And so that many of the lessons that have been learned in more established production markets, in particular around the maturity of management systems that are a hallmark of effective factory management, of effective ESG risk management, those might not necessarily be in place within these new markets that we're looking at. And certainly, should we see these tariff measures come into effect, we can anticipate the risk around how management systems would be, or other forms of ESG risk presenting themselves, becoming more extreme as global supply chains shift. Again, though, this does not necessarily mean there is a fundamental decoupling from China. Now, what does our global risk landscape tell us about the state of supply chain risk in 2024? Our risk outlook has been updated to reflect what are only considered to be transparent assessments of the supply chain, and it has reaffirmed a dynamic that we first began reporting on 2 years previously. The key highlight here is a resounding debunking of the assumption that Western production markets are lower risk. In fact, today, more than half of supply chain sourcing countries are now labeled at high risk or extreme risk. And where we have seen the greatest deterioration is often within Western production markets. Now, revisiting the theme around if this is driven by a fundamental change in the inherent risk landscape or better visibility, it's hard to isolate what is the exact driver of this deterioration. We think both ultimately work in service of this view that there's now greater risk within the West. We're now seeing more audits done on Western firms and more high quality audits in Western markets oftentimes are able to generate greater visibility into risk. But if there is not currently an approach in place for your responsible sourcing program today to look at these risks, we would really recommend that you revisit what has been historically deemed out of scope by programs that have taken a risk based approach to evaluating where they control. Because clearly, here we see that in many of these markets, which folks oftentimes do not spend time scrutinizing ESG practices around, in fact, there is a high likelihood of ESG related problems. We'll get to the specific drivers in just a second. Overall, we find that there are a number of trends that must be monitored based upon this newer evaluation of supply chain risk. The risk of child labor related issues in health and safety violations are increasing. We see that pretty clearly deteriorate across 2024. We also see among the 5 ESG risk pillars, environmental violations relating to environmental management policies have seen a significant increase in risk. In fact, the most significant increase in risk, with nearly 60% of sourcing regions classified as higher extreme risk for these issues. As a whole, health and safety violations remain prevalent, and supplier transparency, again, is generally quite low, which, if anything, suggests that what you do see is probably, in fact, much more problematic than what's reported. When it comes to the deterioration of risk within Western markets, there are a few drivers that are unique to each market. Within the United States, we see that forced labor risks remain high. This is one of the reasons why the United States is rated as high risk. We see risk around child labor is also high, as is concerns around freedom of association. Within Australia, which is mentioned, also transitioned from a medium to high risk market this past year, we've seen concerns around forced labor, in particular, driven by dynamics associated with foreign migrant workers and also freedom of association related concerns. And I bring this point up because it's so important. I know from a lot of our American and Australian clients that generally the view is, well, not in my backyard, but we are here to say that actually what we see based upon how risk is being present within the audits that we have done on site, that in fact these markets too are at high risk of having the most extreme forms of ESG risk present. Specific to the dynamic within Australia for foreign migrant workers, so we've known for a number of years, the past 3 years, that 40% of jobs nearly in Australia were held by temporary visa holders. And data shows that there may be up to 100,000 undocumented workers. The majority of foreign migrant workers in Australia come from countries like India, China, the Philippines, and the United Kingdom. And we've seen over this period that the risk associated with foreign migrant workers and our foreign migrant worker index specifically is high, and it's risen to extreme in 2024. There have been numerous media reports which show migrant workers face low wages, wage gaps, inhumane treatment, overtime hours, in instances of sexual harassment and assault. That the latter of which, oftentimes you need an approach that's much broader than just audit-based protocols to assess. But our steer for those that are looking to address this within their supply chain is you need to think differently about the control mechanisms that you have in place. And in particular, this problem around the transparency of your disclosures. If you're not capturing these risks today through your risk assessment process, you need to have a look at your risk assessment process. For foreign migrant workers in particular, there's certain types of control measures that are often specific that involve local language support that would interview the workers, worker sentiment that is captured and then feeds into it, an assessment of recruitment fees or other issues that might influence the labor conditions by which these foreign migrant workers are brought to market, and also of equal importance then how they're treated once in the country. I know that there's been a lot of public discourse around this, but we have not seen this necessarily addressed in the practices of a lot of Australian firms that are currently working with us to address what might be happening within local production markets. Within the US specifically, as mentioned, there is another set of drivers here. I think the conclusion from how trade ties might shift or how procurement teams might look at working with local partners is that reshoring domestically might not necessarily be lower risk. If anything, again, it elongates the supply chain and could establish risk in new forms that were not present within your operations. We see this in the US specifically around concerns around wages and environmental relations or environmental violations, both of which the US is rated as high risk for. Child labor also is prevalent. And we also see within this, it's regionalized. Certain states perform better or worse than others, but the ones that really are highest risk overall that we've found are the state of New York, California, Pennsylvania, and Florida. A new U.S. administration may well further impact the ESG risk landscape domestically. Well, one theme that I think is particularly interesting is around how labor markets might evolve in the US and how this can potentially push vulnerable workers into informal employment where they face higher risks of exploitation and fewer protections. We know from how Trump has positioned his administration's immigration policy that we are expecting a serious crackdown on border enforcement, potentially deportations. The end consequence of this is oftentimes within an already tight labor market within the U.S. Workers are pushed into spaces where there's even fewer controls in place around them. Um, I would also say that the knock-on effect of this, what we've seen, the United States has experienced pretty high levels of inflation within recent years. Part of this is driven by supply side changes, in part a result of trade policy stemming from the U.S.-China trade war, which increased the final cost to consumers. When consumer prices increase generally, oftentimes where we see that manifest upstream in the supply chain is pressure on existing workers servicing those supply chains and greater risk around labor exploitation. We actually, the New York Times ran a great piece on this earlier this week on migrant workers in the US and how risk may present itself as a result of changes in immigration policy. We have not necessarily seen migrant worker risk deteriorate in the last year. In fact, if anything, according to our indicators, it's improved. But I would also add the important caveat that new policies may very well impact this and should be built into the approach taken to looking at your U.S. production base. Child labor continues to also be challenging, as mentioned within the US. So, our child labor related index worsened in 2024 for the US. It's approached really a high risk margin, although we still classify it as medium risk. The US Department of Labor reported in 2024 that there were more than 730 child labor violations that were uncovered, a decrease from the previous year, but they detected more than 4,000 children employed in violation of the law, a more than 30% increase from 2023. Um, Overall, our child labor risk evaluation for the United States has signaled potential child labor escalations since 2020. Turning now to traditional production markets, we see also with an emergence of new risks that are present within these regions, in particular within Southeast Asia and South Asia. Bangladesh. So, Bangladesh health and safety remains quite problematic. Um, this is a little bit out of the public spotlight as we've moved on from Rana Plaza, but there's been work done to improve worker conditions. We have not necessarily seen this manifest in how risk presents itself within sites. So we saw, in fact, this year a movement from high risk for health and safety violations in Bangladesh to extreme risk. We see critical and extreme risk levels throughout most labor indicators, health and safety indicators, and environmental indicators. Workplace injuries, building safety have also continued to worsen. I would add with this as well, this is part of the reason why beyond audit approach is oftentimes very important to the framework that you use if you're closely connected with Bangladesh. We know oftentimes these risks do not present themselves regularly within audits. However, if you are using any type of monitoring framework, grievance mechanisms, certainly it can play an important role in capturing this risk. Um, Last point on Bangladesh, domestic migrant workers and inhumane treatment also have showed worsening trends by a large margin. I would say, again, building upon this theme of how changes in consumption markets, pricing might impact upstream practices. We have no reason to believe that the situation will improve. If anything, increased price pressure will likely make these extreme risks more extreme and instances of problematic workplace practices more broadly prevalent. A key theme in regulation and within many programs today has been the role that commodity level tracing can play. This is something that has been driven, especially with EUDR regulations within the past year or so. Folks have begun to more closely scrutinize their further removed suppliers. Uh, we'd say that this is really an important advancement and has fast tracked a lot of the works of firms to go deeper in understanding the upstream supply chains that back their operations. But it also can come with the consequence of exposing more extreme risks that you were not necessarily managing previously. This is to be expected, and actually, in the theme of positive disclosure, we would say a sign that your work is working. Your practices of going deeper within the supply chain is they're effectively identifying a higher degree of upstream risk. Um, an unintended consequence of this, though, that we're beginning to see, especially for key commodities, has been, or those that are labeled as high risk by the by measures like the EUDR, is that larger companies have been generally better positioned to absorb the capital expenditures needed to comply with new due diligence processes. This can lead to consolidation and an inclusion gap amongst small and medium-sized enterprises, which actually can exacerbate risk that's already present within oftentimes the types of producers that are already more likely to have ESG related risks present within their sites. Um, I think if we look at what underscores this, uh, we have seen also that outside of just being cut off from markets, this is not necessarily occurring because SMEs do not understand the importance of improving ESG considerations or due diligence measures. Certainly, there has been necessary supplier training work to prepare these sites for what participating in more regulated supply chains would look like and require. But there's oftentimes a extreme level of disconnect between the expectations of these laws and how those expenses would be absorbed. I think a really clear example of this is around climate regulation. Most suppliers that we have spoken to, final stage production SMEs, are very much aware of the imperative to transition their energy mix. Yet very few are able to invest in renewables today, oftentimes because the break even horizon is so far out, as far out as 6-7 years, depending upon the production market. And oftentimes the local policy mix, the incentives around renewables are undeveloped or actually counterproductive in the case of certain markets, that very few are able to even proceed with putting on basic changes in their operations, like using solar panels. And so the challenge that we would have here for responsible sourcing programs, more broadly, is to think about what type of measures within your procurement structures can be used to drive inclusivity rather than cut out parts of your supply chain that are perhaps not of the current standard to which you are now being regulated. Because fundamentally, if your work in responsible sourcing is geared towards continuous improvement of the supply chain through through your trade ties, if it's done in such a way where you are truncating a certain portion of your suppliers, oftentimes those with the most extreme degree of risk, actually you're just obfuscating oftentimes the problem and removing yourself from it as an individual corporate. With this, we do not wish to understate the importance of scrutinizing the business practices that oftentimes can perpetuate problematic dynamics within your supply chain. And for this, actually, this is real data. It's recent, within the past few months or so. Um, we wanted to show just a quick picture of how risk is actually presenting itself within the markets where we are seeing regulations now present. So what you see here is a visualization of working hours related problems within one of Europe's largest retailers. And what we see here is about 10% of its supplier base has I think what can only be constituted as egregious working hour violations. So, what we see out of a sample of 30 factories of 300 that we looked at, that the bottom 10% have continuous working days violations that are as long as 100 days, In some cases, there's outliers where you even see individual workers that'll be worked for 300 days consistently. This occurs in a context where average working days are oftentimes well above 20 days. This is by any legal standard not acceptable, but it's present. And why is it present? This specific instance, the program has relatively robust controls that are in place. These sites are evaluated, audits are run. This data is gathered on their performance practices, but there's something in the nature of the procurement model that clearly highly pressurizes their supplier's labor base in a way that does not enable compliance. And so our challenge, I guess, with this is to think through what types of levers outside of control mechanisms might actually shift the underlying labor conditions with it, because what we see in this case is something that no matter of having a better risk assessment process or control mechanisms will fundamentally address the ESG problems present within these sites, because it's so prevalent that it's a business model related problem. High working hours generally are very problematic both in production markets and in the West. We see this reflected in our 2024 risk ratings. Regions that show the highest risk for working hour violations going into 2025 include Malaysia, Pakistan, India, Taiwan, Mexico, Bangladesh, United States, Cambodia, Thailand, and Australia. And this is not about the West versus production markets. This is something that is present within supply chains and is likely only going to be complicated further should there be changes in global trade policy that would put more pressure on pricing. There's also a really tight correlation to this between working hours violations and health and safety violations. We know in sites like those that we just looked at, where workers are worked so excessively that those sites also tend to underinvest in the health and safety of their workers. And so we can expect as well, should risk around working hours continue to increase in the coming year, we'll also see that reflected in the prevalence of health and safety related issues. Revisiting on the theme of child labor globally, we saw in 2021 that about 2% of audits, there were child labor findings. This increased in 2022 to 2.5% and 3.4% in 2023. At least 49 countries are at high or extreme risk of child labor violations in 2024. Clearly, this goes against a well-developed global set of regulations governing child labor, but it still remains present oftentimes because the root cause behind it is not being addressed. So too, we also see this risk or increased risks around forced labor globally increasing. So since 2023, forced labor related issues were uncovered in at least 40 sourcing countries through audits. This follows a very similar mapping to what we see reflected in risk around child labor and labor violations. More specifically, your protocols are really important in assessing this. And I cannot emphasize enough that if your audit protocol is not asking the right set of questions, and many audit protocols have not historically, you will not be capturing these risks within your supply chain. A couple in particular that are important. So forced labor has been very tightly tied with migrant labor dynamics, excessive recruitment fees, withholding of identity documents, are common drivers of it, but we also see this changing as well too. Those are issues that are very common amongst foreign migrant workers, but in domestic migrant workers, like those that make up a lot of China's supply chains, we also see a high degree or a higher level of fees paid for services like health checks that can place domestic migrant workers in a similarly vulnerable position. We also see amongst these groups key restrictions on workplace rights, like denied access to toilet breaks and withholding of wages and or IDs. And if you don't have a framework in place today for looking at these risks, they are probably present within your supply chain in some form. It's just your risk assessment process is not capturing them effectively. With that, we have a few hopes for 2025, given that we are now in a period where ESG is more important than ever before. It's more regulated than ever before. And we think good, important questions are being asked of what's the purpose of responsible sourcing programs. And so our three hopes for how we would see programs change within the coming year is first to focus on proportionality. So we have presented generally a high level of risk across all global production markets and risks in various forms. Understanding what is material to your supply chain and most critical will allow you to design the risk-based approach to supplier risk management that is asked of most of these due diligence laws, and what you can reasonably achieve with the resources that you have in place within your program today. The expectation is not that you do everything, but that you focus on risk where it's most present. Again, this has to be built around a robust risk assessment process that uses the right sources of data to identify it. Related to this, we also have a hope that we'll see programs focus more on positive disclosure. So that the question asked of the effectiveness of responsible sourcing laws like modern slavery law, we think is a valid one. If these laws have been put in place and nothing is being disclosed, what is the effectiveness of the risk assessment process and the control mechanisms that responsible sourcing programs have built into their approach to management? We know from those who have been very active in positive disclosure that oftentimes they're able to generate the greatest impact on their supply chains. And so our hope is as well for your organization, you're able to position how your work is run in a way where positive disclosure is not viewed as something that might be problematic to your operations. It is a problem to your operations, and it can have bigger questions for it, but it's also a sign that your responsible sourcing program is working. The third area, so we touched on this in the example that we gave of the European retailer, but there is a limit to the effectiveness of responsible sourcing programs if their work is run in isolation. Some of these problems are business model problems, and that involves working with a different set of stakeholders to develop solutions that make sense for your business and your supply chain. In that example that we gave, there is no way that we could expect labor practices to evolve effectively to address the challenge of European law if we are not seeing a change in the way that procurement is fundamentally structured. And so our challenge to you, responsible sourcing managers, would be to figure out how to reach across the table in your organizations and figure out how to pull different levers that you might need, not necessarily to frame this as something that could potentially cut off the relationship with your suppliers, but shift it in a way that you're able to elevate the practices that back your operations. We'd encourage you to reach out to us if you have questions on any specific risk indicators. Our framework for looking at risk, EIQ, covers 31 specific indexes that are built around our audit data. We also do a pretty thorough vetting of which civil society data sets are useful and can be used to build an effective risk management process. We update these risk ratings twice a year, and it's done really out of a belief that the only way that your work in responsible sourcing can have the impact that we know that you seek is if you're asking the right questions of your operations and you are effectively identifying risk as a part of your risk assessment process. With that, I'll turn to questions. One that I see is you cite specific failings within audit protocols that can lead to a poor risk assessment process. What are some of the common failings? Rather than specifically go through different audit protocols, which, by the way, we think a lot of the standards that are out there are great. I would say that one overarching issue that we've seen is that oftentimes the governance processes surrounding individual protocols will cause them to not evolve as quickly as they need to capture how risks might form. In forced labor specifically, we have seen this over the past few years over the treatment of recruitment fees and the use of labor agents. A lot of standards have been slow to build this into their evaluation process. And if your auditors aren't asking those questions, you're certainly not capturing the risk around this. This is sometimes a result of the difficulty of getting many parties involved and bought in to evolving a standard for it within our own standard, and we use multiple audit standards. Our approach generally is for us to decide what we feel the biggest gaps are within our own standard or areas that we might be missing in the way that we assess factory risk. And then without seeking consensus from the industry, build it in. And I think specifically within the labor agents issue, that's one of the reasons why URSA, our audit protocol, had been tracking this a lot longer than others. Similarly, within not audits, but like ethical certification, that's also what we've seen back a lot of the big failings and investigations that we've seen present in exposés, like the one that the New York Times did on sugar supply chains. Bonsucro had been aware of, in that specific case in India, an abnormally high rate of hysterectomies among female workers, but the standard was not designed in such a way that it scrutinized those practices, which led to a masking of the underlying issue. So governance and this question of how you ask the right questions is important. And for that, I don't think for high criticality issues, a consensus-based or an expedient approach that's sometimes taken with mutual recognition schemes can be effective. Similarly, I'd highlight again, perhaps the biggest issue, which is around transparency of disclosures. You're commissioning or you're participating in some sort of scheme that is asked to accurately evaluate sites. What we have seen is within key global production markets like China, in this past year, about half the time, even with a really good standard, there's a accurate reflection of risk. And the way that the disincentives around factories might play into whether or not the audit is accurate. That really cannot be understated for how that might shape the visibility that you have into risk. And oftentimes the question of how the broadly the data is shared, in particular at a time where, again, folks don't really take positive disclosure as a sign of progress, that can be really damning for suppliers. Happy to take questions one to one though on anyone's individual program. Just reach out to us. A second question that I see is, we've talked a bit today around the need to work on business model related problems as a part of the process for controlling or addressing the root cause around risk. And but the question is, what's been effective in doing so? I think that there are a few approaches that are especially helpful now. So your due diligence expectations are greater than ever, and this is not the work of any one individual program to complete. I don't think it's a reasonable expectation that you alone would be able to get full visibility into your supply chain practices. And so I think there is great importance that needs to be put on shared industry collaboration and pooled data, provided that data is of the right quality for getting the first visibility into the issues that are present in site. Because you can't address the business model if the risk assessment process isn't there. One point on this. So a lot of our work in the past year with EIQ has been focused on automating the equivalency process for third-party audits. We think that this is one mechanism of assessing for the full body of data that is potentially available on a supply chain. How do you easily and scalably build that into your risk assessment process? So I think that can be important in framing the challenge to business models. I mentioned also reaching across the table or working with other types of departments and addressing some of these challenges. One that I have great hope for is mechanisms that can be used to recapitalize supply chains, in particular those ex-China. Capital is a little bit less of a problem there through working with procurement teams or your treasury teams on understanding, are there levers, say, around trade finance that you can pull that would allow sites to have greater access to capital or incentivize a lot of the capacity building work that is needed to address social or environmental work? I mean, I think in particular, revisiting the problem that we talked about around lack of adoption of renewable technologies around SMEs, unless you are looking at different trade terms, it's very hard to put an SME in a position where they would actually feel comfortable making those longer term investments. And so there's a few programs that have been built out around that, but I have hope that you all representing brands, buyers, industry can look at pulling those levers maybe a little bit differently. I'd also say programs that have done this really well have done so through oftentimes fundamentally rethinking their procurement structures. And for a lot of folks, what the knee-jerk response has been to cut the tail. We're just over exposed to the number of suppliers that we have. We can't meaningfully work with such a broad array of sites. And I would say that while that might be true and valuable in some cases, that also directly goes against a lot of how we're seeing consumer markets and expectations from suppliers evolving, which tends to be around much more specialized assortment mixes, lower volumes, broader ranges, and so cutting the tail might not be possible. But what you can do for your existing supplier base in that case is also rethink the commitments that you make around how you buy. SME supplier in particular is going to treat your requests to undertake supplier engagement, capacity building work very differently if they feel that you are operating under a horizon of, say, 5 years rather than 1 year. And so I think supply chain teams have historically been very hesitant to operate on those longer periods of time or promise any type of inventory commitments. We have seen, in particular, amongst maybe the more evolved and oftentimes narrower supply chains, a challenge to that, where you are looking at how you might make those type of commitments as an incentive for a supplier to improve their operating standards. With a very transactional relationship, though, you will struggle, and I think the assumption is also with a lot of due diligence laws that in the case that you don't have leverage, you should figure out the mechanisms that you can pull to increase your leverage, and that ties into this question of what internally do you do differently to deepen the relationship you have with suppliers. I appreciate that we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank you all so much for attending, and I would also, we don't necessarily have the answers to a lot of these problems. These are very hard problems at the core of responsible sourcing and how ESG risk presents itself within supply chains. We would love to continue the conversation with you all, because we too share a mission that I know is important to you, of figuring out how we can use our relationship upstream in sites to improve the operating standards of your supply chain. So with that, I'll close. Please do reach out. Please do be in touch. And we would love to hear from you. Thank you.